My sister pushed a heavy crystal display stand straight at my pregnant belly at our parents' anniversary gala. "This is what you get for thinking you are better than this family," she screamed. Glass shattered everywhere. I couldn't breathe. My baby went silent. Then my husband, a federal prosecutor, stepped forward. "You just committed a federal felony," he said. "Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. Before I begin my story, I would love to know which city you are joining us from. Please feel free to share in the comments. Now, let us go back." The ride in the back of the ambulance felt like it lasted for a lifetime. The flashing red lights bounced off the brick buildings of Boston, painting the interior of the vehicle in a frantic, rhythmic glow. I was lying flat on the narrow stretcher, both of my hands clutched tightly over my 6-month pregnant belly. It was entirely too quiet inside of me. Just minutes before we arrived at the gala, my little girl had been kicking so hard, reminding me she was there. Now, there was absolutely nothing. It was a terrifying, suffocating stillness. The paramedic kept speaking to me in a calm, practiced voice, taking my vitals and trying to keep me grounded, but his words sounded like they were traveling through deep water. All I could focus on was the fact that Charmaine, my own sister, had looked me right in the eye before she tipped that massive crystal centerpiece toward me. She knew exactly what she was doing. Beside me, Colton was a statue. My husband is a man of deep, abiding warmth. The kind of person who remembers everyone's birthday and brings me tea every single morning. But in the back of that ambulance, the gentle man I loved was entirely gone. In his place sat the relentless federal prosecutor. His jaw was locked tight, his dark eyes fixed on the hospital doors approaching in the distance. He was already calculating. He was already building a case. We rushed through the emergency room doors, the sterile white lights blinding me temporarily. They wheeled me into a triage room, and the next 20 minutes stretched into an agony of waiting. The doctor applied the cold gel to my stomach. I held my breath. Colton gripped my hand so tightly, I could feel his pulse matching my own erratic heartbeat. We stared at the monitor, praying for a sign. And then, there it was. A rapid, strong, beautiful swoosh filled the quiet room. The sound of our daughter's heartbeat. She was safe. The doctor smiled gently, assuring us that the baby was perfectly fine. Just startled by the sudden shock and my spiked adrenaline, the sheer relief washed over me so completely that my vision blurred. Hot, heavy tears streamed down my face. I pulled my knees up and sobbed into Colton's shoulder. He held me close, burying his face in my hair, letting out a heavy breath. But when he pulled back to look at me, his eyes were devoid of fear. They were entirely cold and analytical. He smoothed the hair away from my forehead. He did not yell or curse. He simply leaned in and spoke with absolute certainty. He made a silent promise. To truly understand how completely Charmaine shattered my world, you have to understand the peace we had built. Earlier that same Saturday morning, the Boston sun was spilling through the bay windows of our apartment, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floor. I was standing in the nursery we had just finished painting a soft, calming green. I was 6 months pregnant, and I felt genuinely strong. I rested a hand on my growing belly, feeling those familiar, rhythmic thumps. My daughter was an active little thing, always pressing her tiny feet against my ribs. From the kitchen, the rich, dark smell of brewing coffee drifted down the hallway, mixing with the faint sound of Colton humming a classical piece. This was our sanctuary. I had spent my entire life walking on eggshells around my family, constantly managing their explosive moods. But with Colton, life was steady. He was a federal prosecutor specializing in high-level public corruption and financial fraud. He spent his days dismantling powerful criminal networks and facing down cartel lawyers. Yet he always came home and left his armor at the door. I met him 5 years ago when I was a pediatric nurse working a shift where he had to interview a young witness. I was struck immediately by his sharp intellect, but more so by the deep, protective kindness in his eyes. I stretched slowly, a careful movement these days, and walked into the kitchen. Colton smiled, handing me a mug of decaf tea. He looked at me like I was the only person in the world. We had a beautiful, quiet life. But the illusion of a perfect Saturday cracked when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text message from Ariadne, my mother. It was not a message asking how her pregnant daughter was feeling. It was a strict directive about the evening's anniversary gala. She reminded me to wear something that would not draw too much attention, to smile for the country club photographers, and above all, to not do anything that might upset Charmaine. Charmaine's art gallery had recently filed for quiet bankruptcy, a closely guarded secret my parents were desperate to hide from their wealthy friends. Ariadne's text was a stark reminder of my assigned role in the family hierarchy. I was the supporting cast, the designated shock absorber for Charmaine's failures. Colton read the message over my shoulder, his jaw tightening slightly. He kissed my forehead, telling me we could leave the party the second I felt uncomfortable. I foolishly believed we could just make an appearance, drop off a gift, and escape back to our peaceful life. I had no idea what was waiting for us. The peace was officially broken. The drive to the prestigious country club in the Boston suburbs felt like marching towards a battlefield. As Colton parked our car among a sea of luxury vehicles, my stomach tied itself into familiar, anxious knots. Ariadne and George were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary, and they had spared no expense to project an image of absolute perfection. We walked into the grand ballroom, greeted by the smell of expensive floral arrangements, roasted meats, and the suffocating air of forced politeness. Ariadne spotted us first. She wore a tailored designer gown and a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She offered me a stiff, theatrical hug, being very careful not to let my pregnant belly wrinkle her silk dress. George gave me a brief nod before turning his attention immediately back to a local politician. Neither of them asked about the baby. Neither of them offered Colton a genuine welcome. We were simply props in their carefully curated social play. I squeezed Colton's hand, seeking his silent reassurance. Then, Charmaine made her grand entrance. She swept into the room wearing an extravagant red dress, laughing loudly and demanding the attention of every person in her vicinity. Her husband, Roman, trailed behind her like a shadow, holding her coat and looking utterly exhausted. Charmaine played the role of the successful, thriving gallery owner to perfection. She was the golden daughter, the crown jewel of the family, and Ariadne beamed with undeniable pride. I watched from a distance, feeling the familiar sting of being the invisible sister. But Colton was not looking at my family with the same emotional baggage. He was looking at the room through the lens of a federal investigator. As we stood near the edge of the ballroom, his posture suddenly changed. He shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the crowd. He subtly stepped closer to me, his voice dropping to a low, quiet murmur. He told me not to look directly, but he pointed out a man standing in the shadows near the terrace doors. The man was wearing a sharp black suit, nursing a drink, and completely ignoring the celebration. Instead, the man was focused entirely on Charmaine. As I subtly watched, Charmaine locked eyes with the stranger. The man gave a slow, deliberate nod. Charmaine's face paled for a fraction of a second before she quickly turned away, grabbing a glass of champagne with a trembling hand. This was not a friendly exchange. This was a silent communication between people who shared a dangerous secret. Colton's federal instincts were instantly on high alert. He knew the faces of Boston's criminal underbelly, and he knew that the man in the black suit did not belong at a society anniversary party. He was watching my sister. To grasp why the man in the black suit was there, you must understand the twisted psychological trap Ariadne and George had built for decades. Growing up, our house was not a home, it was a stage. and the roles were rigidly assigned from the very beginning. Charmaine was the designated golden child. She was loud, demanding, and possessed a superficial charm that my parents believed would secure their status in elite circles. Every resource, every ounce of praise, and every opportunity was funneled directly to her. If Charmaine wanted to study art in Paris, my parents took out a second mortgage without hesitation. When Charmaine threw tantrums and ruined family holidays, Ariadne would quickly sweep it under the rug, claiming her daughter simply had an artistic, passionate temperament. But a stage requires someone to work behind the scenes, and a toxic family requires someone to carry the blame. That was my assigned role. I was the family scapegoat. I was the quiet, observant child who learned early on that the best way to survive was to take up as little space as possible. Whenever Charmaine failed, the blame somehow shifted to me. If she failed a class, Ariadne asked why I had not helped her study. If Charmaine was caught lying, George would lecture me about being a more supportive sister. They normalized her cruelty. They trained me to believe that absorbing Charmaine's toxic behavior was simply what it meant to be a good family member. This dynamic is a classic psychological trap. When a family builds their entire identity around the success of one child, they become blind to that child's darkness. Ariadne and George could not hold Charmaine accountable because doing so would mean admitting their own parenting was a failure. It would mean their perfect country club image was a fraud. So, they continued to feed the monster. They covered Charmaine's debts when her gallery began to collapse. They bought Roman silence by paying for his luxury car. They enabled her to the point where Charmaine truly believed she was untouchable. She believed she could do anything, hurt anyone, and manipulate any situation. And Ariadne and George would always be there to clean up the mess. This toxic normalization was exactly what led us to that ballroom. Because Charmaine had been taught that actions have no consequences. She had become reckless. She had reached a point where draining my parents' bank accounts was no longer enough to fund her delusions. She needed more money, and she was arrogant enough to believe she could step into a criminal arena and walk away unscathed. My parents had spent 30 years creating a perfect, untouchable predator. I was their chosen victim. The only reason I survived my childhood with my sanity intact was because of one person, Grandma Alice. While Ariadne and George were busy polishing their fake elite image, my grandmother was the only one who saw the absolute truth. Alice was a practical, sharp-witted woman who lived in a modest house that always smelled of fresh lavender and old library books. She did not care about country club memberships or designer labels. She cared about character. Whenever the emotional abuse at home became too suffocating, I would ride my bike to Alice's house. She would sit me down at her kitchen table, slide a plate of warm cookies toward me, and listen. She never made excuses for my parents. She never told me to just be the bigger person and forgive Charmaine. Alice validated my reality. She taught me that blood does not give anyone the right to destroy my peace. She was the one who encouraged me to study nursing, telling me that true power comes from building a life of purpose, not from pretending to be important. But Grandma Alice was also a master of strategy. She knew exactly what Ariadne, George, and Charmaine were capable of. During the last few months of her life, as illness began to slow her down, her mind remained as sharp as a razor. I remember sitting by her hospital bed, holding her fragile hand. She asked Ariadne and Charmaine to leave the room, claiming she needed rest. As soon as the door clicked shut, Alice looked at me with an intensity I will never forget. She told me she had quietly hired an independent lawyer. She knew that the moment she passed away, my parents and Charmaine would swarm her estate, taking everything to fund Charmaine's lavish lifestyle. Alice refused to let that happen. She squeezed my hand and whispered that she had set up an impenetrable legal shield just for me. It was something they could never touch, never manipulate, and never destroy. She gave me a small, sealed envelope containing the contact information for her attorney. "I have left a shield for you, Bertha," she said. her voice weak but full of fierce determination. "Do not tell your mother. Do not tell your sister. When the day comes that they finally back you into a corner, and I know they will, you call this number. Tell him you are ready to open box 402. She passed away 3 days later. I cried until I had nothing left, mourning the only parent who truly loved me. I took that envelope, placed it inside a secure safe in my apartment, and tried to move on with my life. I kept the key hidden. Grandma Alice's passing left a massive, echoing void in my life, but she also left me with a profound sense of clarity. The day we buried her, I watched Ariadne and George complain about the modest catering at the reception. I watched Charmaine dramatically fake tears for a woman she had ignored for a decade. Standing in the back of the room, I realized I had to build a life entirely separate from their toxic orbit. I threw myself into my studies and eventually became a pediatric nurse. I wanted to spend my days protecting and caring for vulnerable children, perhaps to heal the small, unprotected child that still lived inside of me. The hospital became my true sanctuary. I worked the long, grueling night shifts, finding genuine peace in the quiet moments of monitoring sleeping infants and comforting terrified parents. Earning my own paycheck gave me a quiet, unshakable pride. I no longer had to rely on George's conditional financial support. I slowly began setting boundaries. I stopped attending every mandatory Sunday dinner. I stopped answering Ariadne's demanding text messages within 60 seconds. Charmaine despised my newfound independence. My quiet, steady happiness was a direct insult to the chaotic, failing life she was trying to hide behind designer clothes. It was during one of my shifts in the pediatric ward that I met Colton. He was a federal prosecutor, sent to gently interview a teenage witness in a complex public corruption case. I expected an arrogant, demanding attorney. Instead, I saw a man in a sharp, tailored suit sit on the floor, hand a terrified child a juice box, and speak with a patience that immediately disarmed the room. We locked eyes over the hospital bed, and an unspoken understanding passed between us. We went out for coffee that evening, and within a year, we were married. My parents barely acknowledged the wedding. Ariadne complained that a government employee was not a lucrative enough match. And Charmaine spent the entire reception complaining about the venue's lighting. I did not care. For the first time in my life, I had a real family. Colton understood the deep, invisible scars my childhood had left. He never pushed me to reconcile with Ariadne, nor did he ask me to forgive Charmaine's endless stream of passive-aggressive insults. He simply stood beside me, a steady, immovable force. When I found out I was pregnant with our daughter, I promised myself that this child would never know the conditional love I grew up with. I had built a beautiful, safe life far away from their delusions. I foolishly believed the physical distance would be enough to keep the darkness at bay. I thought my boundaries were strong enough to protect my growing family. I was tragically mistaken. The distance only fueled their anger. The air inside the country club ballroom was heavy with the scent of expensive perfume, roasted meats, and absolute desperation. I stood near a massive floral arrangement, trying to blend into the background while Ariadne paraded Charmaine around the room. I was 6 months pregnant, wearing a simple navy dress, and feeling entirely exhausted by the endless charade. Colton stood right beside me, his hand resting reassuringly on the small of my back. For an hour, we managed to remain invisible. But visibility is a currency Charmaine demands, and she could not tolerate us standing quietly in the corner. She marched over to our table, her eyes flashing with a familiar, dangerous, manic energy. Roman trailed behind her, looking down at his shoes. Charmaine immediately launched into a loud, theatrical critique of my appearance. She mocked my conservative dress and loudly pitied Colton for living on a restrictive government salary. The surrounding guests turned to watch the spectacle. Years ago, I would have shrunk away. I would have apologized just to end the humiliation. But I was no longer that frightened child. I smiled politely, keeping my voice perfectly even and calm. I told her that our life was peaceful and that we were very happy. My calmness infuriated her. Charmaine thrived on creating emotional chaos, and my refusal to participate felt like a physical blow to her ego. She looked around the room, realizing she was losing her audience. Her eyes darted toward the terrace doors. I followed her gaze and saw the man in the black suit. He was still standing there, watching her intently. He raised his hand and tapped the face of his wristwatch. A deadline. Charmaine's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of red. She needed a scene. She needed a scandal. She turned back to me, screaming that I thought I was better than the family. She took a step backward, intentionally knocking her shoulder into a towering, heavy crystal display stand holding a massive ice sculpture. It was not a clumsy stumble. It was a calculated, forceful shove. The massive pillar tilted. Time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl. The heavy crystal structure tipped forward, plummeting directly toward where I stood. I twisted my body instinctively, wrapping my arms around my belly to shield my unborn daughter. The heavy base struck my side, knocking the wind out of my lungs completely. I crashed to the carpeted floor. The crystal structure shattered upon impact, sending sharp, brilliant shards exploding across the room. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. The music stopped instantly. I lay on the floor, gasping for air that refused to fill my lungs. The physical pain radiated through my side, but it was nothing compared to the sheer, blinding terror inside my mind. I pressed my hands to my stomach. The kicking had completely stopped. Pure pandemonium swallowed the country club. Waiters dropped trays, guests shrieked, and the string quartet abruptly abandoned their instruments. Colton was on his knees beside me before the last piece of crystal even hit the floor. His hands hovered over me, checking for severe injuries without moving my spine. I was gasping, tears blurring my vision, desperately whispering that the baby was not moving. The country club manager scrambled over, frantically shouting for someone to call an ambulance. Through the chaos, I saw Ariadne. She was not running toward me. She was intercepting a local Boston police officer who had been working security at the front door. She grabbed the officer's arm, laughing nervously, gesturing wildly toward the broken glass. She was already spinning the narrative. She told the officer it was just a clumsy accident, a silly misunderstanding between sisters, and there was absolutely no need for a police report. The local officer, easily intimidated by the wealth of the room, nodded and began to put his notepad away. Charmaine stood behind Ariadne, wiping away a fake tear, looking incredibly smug. Colton saw it all. He helped me sit up against a pillar as the paramedics finally burst through the doors. Once I was securely in the hands of the medical team, Colton stood up. He did not yell. He did not curse. He slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket and pulled out his leather credential case. He flipped it open, revealing the gold shield of the United States Department of Justice. He walked directly up to the local police officer, his voice cutting through the noise of the room like a blade of ice. He instructed the local officer to step down immediately. He declared the ballroom an active federal crime scene. He stated, loudly and clearly for the entire room to hear, that Charmaine had just committed a premeditated felony assault on the immediate family member of a sitting federal prosecutor. The local officer's face went pale. He stepped back, instantly yielding jurisdiction. Ariadne stopped talking mid-sentence, her jaw dropping in absolute shock. Colton pulled out his phone and dialed the local FBI field office, requesting immediate dispatch of evidence response teams. He demanded they secure the security footage from every camera in the building before management could tamper with it. Charmaine's smug expression vanished entirely. The realization of what she had just triggered finally washed over her. She was no longer dealing with a compliant sister and a forgiving mother. She had just declared war on the United States government. Colton turned his back on them, walking alongside my stretcher as they wheeled me out. The trap was now closed. The sterile walls of the emergency room felt like a fortress. Once the doctor found the strong, steady heartbeat of my daughter, the crushing weight of terror finally lifted off my chest. I lay in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, utterly exhausted but overwhelmingly grateful. Colton sat in the chair beside me, holding my hand, his phone constantly buzzing with updates from the FBI agents securing the country club. We were safe. We were together. Then, the heavy wooden door to my room swung open. Ariadne and George rushed in. For one brief, foolish second, the wounded child inside me thought they had come to comfort me. I thought they were terrified that they had almost lost their unborn granddaughter. But Ariadne did not rush to my bedside. She did not look at the fetal monitor. She did not ask if I was in pain. She walked straight up to Colton, her face flushed with indignation. She demanded that Colton call off the federal agents immediately. She hissed that he was overreacting, that Charmaine was just clumsy, and that a federal investigation would utterly destroy their social standing at the club. George stood right behind her, nodding in silent agreement. He told Colton that family matters should be handled privately, behind closed doors. They were actually asking me to sacrifice my daughter's safety, to ignore a violent assault, all to protect Charmaine's image and their country club membership. I stared at the two people who had brought me into this world. I waited for the familiar wave of guilt, the urge to apologize and make peace. But the well was completely dry. The years of conditioning, the decades of absorbing their toxic manipulation, simply shattered. Looking at them, I did not see my parents. I saw two enablers who had built a monster and were entirely willing to let that monster destroy my child. I felt absolutely nothing for them. No anger, no sadness, just a cold, clinical detachment. I squeezed Colton's hand. He understood instantly. He stood up, his towering frame blocking their view of my bed. He informed them, in a voice entirely devoid of emotion, that they were interfering with a federal witness. He pointed to the door and told them to leave the hospital immediately, or he would have them escorted out by federal marshals. Ariadne gasped, deeply offended. But Colton did not blink. George grabbed her arm, pulling her out of the room as she muttered insults under her breath. The door clicked shut, severing the last fragile tie I had to my bloodline. I was finally completely free. We returned to our Boston apartment the following morning. The quiet of our home was a stark contrast to the absolute frenzy exploding outside. My body ached deeply from the impact of the fall, dark bruises blooming across my side. But the baby was active and safe. The moment we walked through the door, my phone began vibrating relentlessly. Ariadne called 32 times. George left numerous voicemails demanding a family meeting. Charmaine sent a barrage of dramatic texts, shifting the blame, accusing me of standing in the wrong place and ruining her life. As a triage nurse, you learn to quickly identify true emergencies. Their frantic panic was not my emergency. Responding would only feed oxygen to their hysteria. I simply opened my settings and blocked all 3 of their numbers. Silence is the most terrifying and powerful weapon you can use against toxic people. Narcissists feed on your reaction. They want your anger, your tears, your desperate attempts to explain yourself. Because any reaction means they still have control over your emotions. By giving them absolute silence, I starved them. I reclaimed my power. I spent my days resting on the sofa, drinking warm tea, and reading books to the baby growing inside me. I focused entirely on protecting my peace. I allowed myself to heal from the trauma, refusing to let their poison infect my pregnancy any further. Meanwhile, a different kind of storm was brewing just down the hallway. Colton was locked inside his home office. The low, continuous hum of his voice on secure conference calls seeped through the walls. The printer ran late into the night, churning out stacks of legal documents. He was meticulously building an airtight cage, The FBI agents had already secured the country club footage, carefully preserving the chain of custody. Colton was quietly filing subpoenas to pull Charmaine's financial records, treating her exactly like the targets of his high-profile corruption cases. He was moving with the precise, surgical efficiency of a man who dismantles criminal syndicates for a living. He did not need to scream at my parents or threaten my sister. The machinery of the federal justice system was already in motion, cold and unstoppable. I watched him work from the doorway, feeling a profound sense of safety. I did not need to fight my family anymore. The law would do it for me. 3 days after the incident, late in the evening, a frantic, rhythmic knocking echoed from our front door. Colton checked the security monitor and frowned before opening it. Roman stood in the hallway. Charmaine's husband looked absolutely, entirely ruined. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, his face was pale, and dark circles dragged under his panicked eyes. He looked over his shoulder nervously before begging Colton for a few minutes of his time. He was terrified. We brought him into the kitchen, offering him a glass of water that trembled violently in his hands. Roman was a weak man, a coward who had enabled Charmaine's behavior for years because it afforded him a comfortable lifestyle. But the comfort was gone. The FBI had visited his office that morning to ask questions about his wife, and the reality of federal prison had broken his fragile loyalty. Sitting at our kitchen table, the dam burst. Roman started talking rapidly, his voice cracking with fear. He confessed that Charmaine's art gallery had been completely bankrupt for over a year. They were drowning in massive debt. But more importantly, Roman had been going through her home office looking for a specific bill and stumbled upon a hidden laptop. He found records of offshore shell accounts. Someone had been quietly depositing large sums of money into these untraceable accounts for the past 3 months. And the most damning detail of all, a deposit of $50,000 had arrived just 2 days before the anniversary gala. Charmaine had not pushed that crystal display merely out of sudden jealousy. She was on a payroll. She had been hired to cause a massive, public scandal, specifically targeting me to create a horrific scene that would drag Colton's name into the tabloids. Roman wept, apologizing profusely, claiming he had no idea she would actually go through with something so violent. Colton did not offer him any comfort. He calmly took notes, securing the exact routing numbers Roman had memorized in his panic. The narrative had completely shifted. This was no longer a tragic family dispute or an escalating sibling rivalry. It was a contracted, premeditated assault designed to manipulate a federal prosecutor. Charmaine had sold out her own pregnant sister to the highest bidder. Roman left our apartment shivering, knowing his cooperation might be the only thing keeping him out of handcuffs. Colton closed the door, his eyes dark with absolute fury. The real hunt had begun. The days following Roman's frantic late-night confession were remarkably quiet inside our apartment. While the outside world buzzed with frantic rumors, Colton retreated into the digital shadows of his home office. My husband is a man who speaks the complex language of financial forensics fluently. To him, a wire transfer is never simply money moving from one place to another. It is a digital fingerprint, leaving a permanent trail of metadata, routing codes, and IP addresses that absolutely cannot be erased. I spent my afternoons resting on the living room sofa, drinking herbal tea and feeling our daughter kick gently against my ribs. I watched Colton work from a distance. The cool blue glow of his multiple monitors illuminated his focused, unblinking expression. He was systematically dismantling Charmaine's entire life. Colton did not need to shout, and he certainly did not need to make empty threats. His weapon of choice was a federal subpoena. Using his established authority as a prosecutor, he quietly compelled the banking institutions to release the specific transaction records Roman had identified in his panic. Watching Colton work brought me a profound, anchoring sense of peace. There is a very specific type of justice in paperwork. It is cold, it is entirely objective, and it does not care about Ariadne's country club reputation. Colton traced the $50,000 through a complex labyrinth of offshore shell companies. It was a highly sophisticated laundering operation, far beyond Charmaine's limited intellectual capacity or business acumen. Someone incredibly powerful and incredibly wealthy was guiding her hand. Colton worked late into the night, meticulously cross-referencing dates, timestamps, and transaction origins. He discovered that the money had been officially cleared and deposited just 48 hours before the anniversary gala at the country club. This verified timeline proved the incident was entirely premeditated. Charmaine had not acted out of a sudden, uncontrollable burst of sibling jealousy. She had executed a paid contract. I watched Colton organize the printed financial documents into perfectly aligned folders on his large oak desk. He was building an undeniable, airtight narrative of federal conspiracy. Every single piece of paper he printed was another iron nail in Charmaine's coffin. He tried to shield me from the darkest, granular details to keep my pregnancy stress levels low. But I could read the grim quiet satisfaction in his rigid posture. He had finally found the exact origin of the illicit funds, and the absolute truth was far more sinister than we ever could have imagined. Charmaine was simply a remarkably greedy pawn in a much larger, darker game. Colton gathered the final stack of printed bank statements, tapped the edges against his desk to align them perfectly, and slipped them into a secure leather briefcase. He looked over at me, his dark eyes reflecting a terrifying, calculated calm. He had the irrefutable proof he needed to bring the federal hammer down. The numbers told the truth. Before Colton could formally present his findings to his superiors at the Department of Justice, a courier arrived at our apartment building. The concierge brought up a thick, heavy envelope made of expensive parchment paper, requiring my direct signature. I opened it at the kitchen island, feeling a familiar wave of disgust wash over me. It was a formal legal demand letter from a highly expensive, deeply aggressive downtown law firm hired by Charmaine. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the document was absolutely staggering. The letter did not contain a single word of apology for the assault at the country club. Instead, Charmaine's attorney formally accused me of defamation, public slander, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The document absurdly claimed that I had purposefully stood in the way of the falling crystal display to stage an injury, all because I was allegedly jealous of Charmaine's success. It demanded that Colton immediately drop any and all federal inquiries. Furthermore, it demanded that I issue a public, written apology to Charmaine and pay her $250,000 to compensate for her newly ruined reputation in the Boston art community. I read the demands twice, genuinely unable to comprehend the level of delusion required to draft such a document. Charmaine had nearly killed my unborn child, yet she was actively painting herself as the tragic, persecuted victim. This is the ultimate hallmark of a deeply toxic personality. When confronted with their own horrific actions, they will never take accountability. They will simply rewrite reality, twisting the narrative until they are the ones who deserve sympathy and compensation. Do you think greed and entitlement can turn a relative into an absolute monster? If this resonates with you, please type "agree" down in the comments below. I handed the heavy parchment letter to Colton when he walked into the kitchen. He read it silently, his expression remaining perfectly blank. He did not scoff or tear the paper in anger. He simply walked over to his briefcase, opened it, and slid Charmaine's ridiculous demand letter right next to the thick stack of subpoenaed bank records proving her federal crimes. "Keep this," Colton said quietly, a faint, dangerous smile touching the corners of his mouth. Juries absolutely love it when the defendant demonstrates a complete lack of remorse prior to indictment. Charmaine thought she was intimidating us. She firmly believed that throwing expensive legal jargon and demanding money would force me back into my lifelong role of the compliant, silent scapegoat. She expected me to fold under the pressure, just as Ariadne and George always did. But I was not standing alone in the shadows anymore. I was standing safely behind a fortress of federal authority. She demanded an apology. That evening, Colton sat me down in our living room. The warm, ambient light from the street lamps outside cast a soft glow across his serious face. He held a heavy blue folder in his hands, resting it carefully on his lap. He told me he had finally traced the ultimate source of the $50,000. The money had not come from a random art investor or a desperate gallery client. It came directly from a man named Jason. Jason was a prominent, highly connected billionaire whom Colton had been quietly investigating for massive public corruption and racketeering for the past 2 years. Jason knew the federal indictment was looming, and he knew Colton was the lead prosecutor entirely immune to traditional bribery. So, Jason sought a different angle of attack. He needed to create a massive, highly publicized personal scandal that would force Colton to recuse himself from the case due to overwhelming family distress. Jason needed a weak, deeply greedy insider to detonate a bomb inside our personal lives. Charmaine was the absolute perfect candidate. She possessed the exact combination of financial desperation, moral bankruptcy, and deep-seated envy to accept the job. But the betrayal went significantly deeper than Charmaine simply accepting dirty money to orchestrate an assault. Colton opened the blue folder and showed me the precise routing documents. Charmaine had not been stupid enough to have Jason wire the $50,000 directly into her failing gallery's business account. She knew the local tax agencies were already monitoring her failing business. Instead, Charmaine had utilized a separate, seemingly innocuous account to receive and wash the illicit funds before quietly transferring them to herself. I looked closely at the highlighted name on the banking document, and all the air completely left my lungs. The intermediary account belonged to Ariadne and George. Charmaine had secretly forged their digital signatures, using her parents' quiet, decades-old retirement account as a financial pass-through for federal bribery money. She had deliberately dragged Ariadne and George into a massive money laundering conspiracy without their knowledge, solely to protect herself from direct federal scrutiny. Ariadne and George had spent 30 years defending Charmaine, financing her extravagant lifestyle, and treating her like an infallible golden idol. They had sacrificed my childhood and my emotional well-being just to keep Charmaine happy and comfortable. And in return, the moment Charmaine needed a shield for her own criminal behavior, she used their life savings as a human shield. She had unknowingly handed the Department of Justice the complete legal authority to freeze and seize every single dollar Ariadne and George had ever saved. The poetic, tragic justice of the situation was sickeningly brilliant. Charmaine framed her own parents. Sitting in the dim light of our living room, the full scope of the devastation finally settled heavily over me. Charmaine had not just physically targeted my unborn daughter, she had maliciously orchestrated a scenario that would inevitably destroy Ariadne and George. As much as my parents had enabled my abuser, the realization that they were about to lose their home, their retirement, and their beloved country club status to federal asset forfeiture was a difficult reality to completely process. However, my fleeting moment of pity evaporated the instant I remembered Ariadne's reaction at the hospital. I vividly remembered her standing at the foot of my bed, demanding that Colton drop the charges, prioritizing Charmaine's fragile reputation over the very survival of my baby. They had made their bed, and now the federal government was going to fiercely force them to lie in it. But the impending collapse of my parents' finances triggered a sudden, deeply urgent alarm in my mind. I knew Ariadne and George intimately. The very moment their retirement accounts were frozen by Colton's ongoing investigation, they would panic. They would desperately look for another source of capital to hire expensive defense attorneys for themselves and for their golden child. And I knew exactly who they would target next. They would come after me. They would try to emotionally manipulate me into liquidating my own savings, demanding that I fulfill my lifelong duty as the family scapegoat to rescue them from the consequences of Charmaine's actions. I absolutely refused to let them touch a single cent of the future. Colton and I were carefully building for our daughter. I needed a way to completely sever my financial vulnerability. A way to make myself legally untouchable before the federal indictments officially dropped and the real chaos began. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the sofa, searching for a permanent solution. Suddenly, a distinct memory pierced through the anxiety. I smelled fresh lavender and old library books. I saw the determined, fiercely protective eyes of Grandma Alice. I remembered her sitting in her quiet hospital bed, slipping that sealed envelope into my trembling hands. I remembered her exact words, warning me that a day would eventually come when Ariadne and Charmaine would back me into an impossible corner. She had promised me that she had quietly built a shield for me, an impenetrable legal wall that they could never cross. I opened my eyes, my heart suddenly racing with a new, powerful resolve. I turned to Colton, interrupting his review of the complex banking documents. I told him we needed to visit a specific bank in downtown Boston first thing in the morning. It was time to fight. The following morning, a crisp, cool wind swept through the busy streets of downtown Boston. Colton and I walked into the grand, marble-floored lobby of the oldest financial institution in the city. I carried the small, worn brass key that Grandma Alice had given me years ago. We were escorted down into the silent, highly secure basement vault by a polite bank manager. The heavy steel door clicked open, revealing rows of polished metal deposit boxes. I found box number 402. My hands trembled slightly as I inserted the key, feeling the satisfying, heavy clunk of the lock turning. Inside the long metal drawer rested a thick, beautifully bound leather folder and a small, handwritten letter addressed to me. I opened the letter first. Alice's elegant cursive handwriting instantly brought tears to my eyes. She wrote that she always knew Charmaine's deep entitlement would eventually completely consume Ariadne and George, and that they would inevitably try to drain my resources to save themselves. Alice refused to let her legacy be wasted on their toxic delusions. I opened the heavy leather folder. Inside was an irrevocable trust. Alice had quietly transferred the entirety of her considerable estate, including several highly valuable property deeds and a substantial stock portfolio, directly into this trust. She had named me as the sole, exclusive beneficiary. But the brilliant, protective magic of the document lay in its rigid structure. Because it was an irrevocable trust, the assets were legally locked away from any external claims. Ariadne could not sue for it. George could not demand it. And Charmaine could absolutely never touch a single penny of it to pay her mounting federal legal fees. But Alice's foresight did not stop at financial protection. Beneath the trust documents lay a thick, notarized journal. I opened the pages and gasped. For over 15 years. Grandma Alice had meticulously documented every single instance of Charmaine's financial abuse, manipulation, and cruelty. She had recorded exact dates where Ariadne had covered up Charmaine's petty thefts, and detailed times when George had forced me to take the blame for Charmaine's destructive behavior. Alice had signed every single entry in the presence of an official notary public. It was a masterclass in silent observation. Alice had collected decades of hard, undeniable evidence proving a consistent, established pattern of malicious behavior and parental enablement. This journal was the missing puzzle piece Colton needed to absolutely destroy any defense Charmaine's expensive lawyers might try to build regarding her character. We stood in the quiet vault, surrounded by the ghosts of my family's lies, holding the undeniable truth. Alice had protected me from beyond the grave. Colton carefully placed the journal into his secure briefcase. We had the ultimate weapon. Back at our secure apartment, Colton spread the contents of Grandma Alice's vault across the large dining room table. It was a terrifyingly efficient, clinical display of federal power. I sat quietly across from him, sipping a warm cup of herbal tea, watching as he meticulously matched Alice's notarized journal entries with the complex offshore banking records Roman had provided. I had spent my entire life watching Ariadne and George resolve conflicts through loud screaming matches, vicious emotional manipulation, and thrown objects. I genuinely thought that was what fighting back looked like. But sitting in that quiet room, Colton showed me a completely different, far more lethal kind of warfare. He explained the profound, crushing weight of justice achieved through proper legal documentation. When you are dealing with narcissists, arguing with them is entirely useless, Colton told me quietly, his eyes scanning a bank statement. They will simply gaslight you, twist your words, and rewrite the narrative to make themselves the victim. But you cannot gaslight a verified bank routing number. You cannot emotionally manipulate a federal subpoena. By legally freezing Ariadne and George's retirement accounts, Colton had completely bypassed their ability to argue or defend themselves. A federal freeze order does not care about your social status at the country club. It does not care how loudly you complain or how many influential friends you claim to have. It instantly strips away your resources, leaving you entirely powerless and exposed. Furthermore, because Grandma Alice's irrevocable trust was completely separate from any of their financial influence, Charmaine had absolutely no legal avenue to drain my assets to pay for her looming criminal defense. The precise, calculated paperwork was the ultimate, inescapable trap. Colton did not raise his voice a single time while he compiled the devastating federal indictment against my sister. He simply stacked the perfectly printed papers into neat, undeniable piles, highlighting specific dates and tracking the flow of illicit money. He was entirely dismantling my abusers using ink, official government stamps, and irrefutable digital footprints. There is a profound, breathtaking beauty in the cold objectivity of the law. My family had spent decades teaching me that I was powerless against Charmaine's selfish demands. But looking at the organized stack of federal documents, I realized I had never been powerless. I had simply never possessed the right tools or the right ally to fight back effectively. Now, I held the entire, crushing weight of the United States justice system safely in my hands. The next morning, Colton formally submitted the massive evidence file to his superiors at the Department of Justice. The grand jury moved with terrifying, unyielding speed. Within 48 hours, formal summons were securely issued. Charmaine, Ariadne, and George were officially ordered to appear at the federal prosecutor's downtown office for a mandatory, recorded deposition. They thought they were coming to negotiate a quiet settlement. The board was finally set. The federal building in downtown Boston is a massive, imposing structure of brutalist concrete and tinted glass. It is a place intentionally designed to make you feel incredibly small. But as I walked through the heavy security doors holding Colton's hand, I felt like an absolute giant. For my own emotional safety, I was led into a quiet observation room behind a large piece of one-way glass, accompanied by a gentle federal victim advocate. Colton walked alone into the austere, brightly lit deposition room right next door. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden door swung open. Charmaine strutted into the room wearing a tailored, incredibly expensive designer suit, looking absolutely indignant and supremely confident. Ariadne and George trailed closely behind her, accompanied by a silver-haired, highly paid defense attorney who carried himself with an aura of practiced, irritating arrogance, even inside a secure federal building. Ariadne was desperately trying to control the narrative. Before anyone even sat down at the table, Ariadne loudly complained to the room about the ridiculous inconvenience of this early morning meeting. She insisted that the entire situation was just a silly misunderstanding. Charmaine rolled her eyes dramatically, sighing loudly, acting as if she had been summoned to court for a minor, annoying traffic violation. The defense attorney immediately took control, demanding that Colton dismiss the federal inquiry entirely citing complex family dynamics and a complete lack of substantial, actionable evidence. From my safe vantage point behind the glass, I watched Colton. He did not interrupt them. He let them speak, allowing their arrogant entitlement and foolish confidence to completely fill the quiet room. He simply sat at the head of the long, polished conference table, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his handsome face a mask of absolute professional detachment. When the highly paid lawyer finally finished his blustering, aggressive speech, Colton simply nodded slowly. He reached into his dark leather briefcase and pulled out a single, crisp sheet of paper. He slid it across the smooth wooden table. It was the formal federal order, freezing all of Charmaine's personal and business assets. Effective immediately. "We are not here to negotiate a family dispute," Colton said, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying pitch that commanded absolute authority. "We are here to formally review the undeniable evidence of your client's federal crimes." Charmaine looked down at the official freeze order, her confident, mocking smirk faltering for the very first time. She looked at her expensive attorney, deep confusion washing over her perfectly made-up face. Ariadne gasped loudly, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest in shock. George immediately puffed out his chest, stepping forward to demand an explanation. But Colton simply raised a single index finger, silencing him instantly. The room grew incredibly cold. The game was officially over. The atmosphere inside the sterile deposition room shifted violently from arrogant annoyance to sudden, suffocating anxiety. Charmaine's defense attorney quickly picked up and reviewed the asset freeze order. His professional composure cracked visibly as he noted the official federal seals and the signature of a federal judge. He cleared his throat and attempted to pivot quickly, arguing that freezing his client's entire financial life over a minor physical altercation was a gross, unconstitutional overreach of prosecutorial power. He claimed Charmaine was a highly respected gallery owner with an unblemished personal record. He boldly suggested that I was simply a jealous, emotionally unstable sister, prone to dramatic exaggeration. From my safe, hidden vantage point behind the one-way glass, I felt my heart race slightly, but I did not panic. I knew exactly what Colton was going to do next. Colton calmly reached back into his leather briefcase and produced Grandma Alice's heavy, beautifully bound journal. He placed it firmly on the table. The dull thud echoed loudly in the silent, tense room. Colton looked directly at Charmaine, his dark eyes entirely devoid of any mercy or hesitation. He opened the journal to the first carefully bookmarked page. He began to read aloud. He did not read with anger or malice. He read with the crisp, objective, lethal precision of a veteran courtroom prosecutor. He read Alice's detailed, notarized accounts of Charmaine's severe emotional abuse, her petty financial thefts from the family, and her relentless, calculated campaigns to destroy my personal reputation. He read exact dates, specific amounts of stolen money, and the precise times Ariadne had actively helped cover up the evidence to protect the family image. As Colton read page after agonizing page, the color completely drained from Charmaine's face. Her carefully constructed, lifelong facade of the innocent, highly successful sister shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before her eyes. The defense attorney looked absolutely horrified. He had clearly been lied to by his own client regarding her supposedly flawless background. This journal was a notarized, legally admissible document establishing a 15-year pattern of malicious, sociopathic behavior. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the assault at the country club was not an isolated, emotional incident, but the violent culmination of a lifetime of unchecked cruelty. Charmaine tried to speak, to call the journal a ridiculous fake, but her voice caught sharply in her throat. She looked at Colton, and for the first time in her entire privileged life, she realized she was facing a concrete wall she could not scream her way through. if you feel a deep sense of satisfaction watching the truth finally being exposed, please give this video a like right now. Colton closed the heavy leather journal and slid it deliberately toward the defense attorney. The golden child was exposed. The devastating, undeniable impact of Grandma Alice's notarized journal had completely paralyzed Charmaine's expensive defense attorney. But Colton was far from finished. He was dismantling the toxic empire brick by brick. And it was finally time to address the enablers who had built the monster. Ariadne and George stood frozen near the back of the conference room, looking pale, terrified, and thoroughly disoriented. Ariadne finally found her fragile voice, stepping forward with heavy tears streaming down her carefully powdered face. She pleaded with Colton, begging him desperately to stop this federal madness. She claimed that Charmaine was deeply sick, that she needed psychiatric help and family support, not federal prison time. She frantically promised that she and George would personally pay for whatever medical bills I had from the gala, insisting they would gladly use their retirement savings to make this entire nightmare go away quietly. Colton looked at Ariadne with a gaze so incredibly cold it could have frozen the ocean. He slowly pulled the final blue folder from his briefcase. He opened it and extracted the highlighted banking documents he had spent countless nights verifying. He did not hand the papers to Charmaine. He walked over and handed them directly to George. Colton informed my parents, in a stark, clinical, unforgiving tone, that they could not use their retirement savings to pay for anything. Their accounts had been officially and permanently frozen by the United States Treasury. George stared blindly at the paper, his hands trembling wildly as he read the official federal notice. Ariadne demanded to know why they were being unfairly targeted by the government. Colton explained, with brutal, devastating clarity, that Charmaine had maliciously forged their digital signatures. She had used their clean, decades-old retirement accounts as a covert routing station to launder $50,000 in illicit bribery funds from Jason, a known criminal billionaire. The silence that followed his words was absolute and terrifying. It was the tragic sound of a 30-year delusion violently collapsing in on itself. Ariadne let out a strangled, horrified gasp, turning slowly to look at her golden child. George's face turned a dangerous, furious shade of crimson. They had sacrificed my entire childhood, my emotional safety, and nearly the life of my unborn baby to protect Charmaine's image. And Charmaine had repaid their endless, blind loyalty by framing them for federal money laundering. She had stripped them of their wealth, their home, and their precious country club status in one single, incredibly selfish move. Ariadne collapsed heavily into a nearby chair, sobbing uncontrollably into her shaking hands. George simply turned his back on the daughter he once worshipped. Charmaine had destroyed them all. The total destruction of Ariadne and George's financial security left the deposition room in a state of suffocating, heavy despair. But the true, ultimate target of Colton's investigation was still hovering in the dark shadows. Colton turned his attention completely back to Charmaine and her increasingly nervous, sweating defense attorney. He reached into his briefcase one final time, producing a thick, formally bound legal document bearing the prestigious official seal of the Department of Justice. It was a comprehensive, multi-count federal indictment. Colton laid it perfectly flat on the center of the table and began listing the charges with methodical, devastating precision. Charmaine was formally charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and the premeditated, violent assault of a family member of a federal official in an attempt to intentionally obstruct justice. But the absolute fatal blow came when Colton revealed the highly classified name of her wealthy co-conspirator. He announced that Jason, the corrupt billionaire who had orchestrated the entire dark operation to derail the prosecution, had been arrested at his private estate at dawn that very morning. Colton casually mentioned that Jason's cowardly associates had already begun cooperating heavily with the FBI. They had quickly offered up Charmaine's name as the desperate, incredibly greedy insider who had happily accepted the violent contract. The walls were rapidly closing in, leaving absolutely no room to breathe. Charmaine's defense attorney wiped cold beads of sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. He knew that defending a client against a comprehensive federal corruption probe, complete with cooperating billionaire witnesses and hard, undeniable financial evidence, was a completely impossible task. Charmaine, finally realizing that her parents could not magically save her, and her powerful benefactor was already in handcuffs, completely broke down. The arrogant, untouchable golden child vanished instantly, replaced by a terrified, sobbing, broken woman. She slammed her manicured hands on the polished table, begging Colton to show her mercy. She pleaded desperately that we were family, that she was my sister, and that she would do absolutely anything to make it right. She promised to leave Boston forever and never contact us again. She begged for a generous plea deal, promising to testify against Jason if Colton would just keep her out of a federal penitentiary. From my safe observation room, I watched her cry those familiar tears. It was the exact same theatrical, manipulative performance she used when we were children. But Colton did not blink. He simply stared at her, utterly unmoved by the desperate, pathetic display. The United States government does not negotiate with domestic terrorists, Colton stated coldly. The room fell entirely silent again, but the defense attorney suddenly sat up straighter. He reached into his expensive leather briefcase, a faint, desperate smile creeping onto his face. He pulled out a small silver flash drive and held it up. He played his final card. The defense attorney held the small silver flash drive up with a sudden, unexpected burst of renewed confidence. He cleared his throat loudly, addressing Colton with a smug, highly patronizing tone. He claimed that before they discussed any formal indictments or plea deals, Colton needed to hear a crucial, game-changing piece of evidence. The attorney plugged the drive into his sleek laptop and pressed play. A grainy, slightly distorted audio recording immediately filled the tense room. It was my voice. The recording sounded exactly like I was screaming furiously at Charmaine, calling her pathetic, and explicitly threatening to ruin her life if she didn't leave my family alone. The audio cut off abruptly with the sharp, violent sound of breaking glass. The attorney smiled broadly, arguing that the recording proved definitively that I was the primary aggressor at the country club gala. He claimed Charmaine had merely acted in justifiable self-defense against an unstable, hostile sister, and that this shocking audio would introduce massive, reasonable doubt into any criminal proceeding. For a brief, terrifying second, my heart stopped completely in my chest. I had never said those horrific things. It was a complete, malicious fabrication, but it sounded exactly like my voice. I looked at Colton through the one-way glass, terrified that this fake evidence might actually derail the entire case. There is a specific kind of terror when a narcissist tries to rewrite reality using fake evidence. They rely on the fact that most people will doubt themselves, but my husband's training analyzing corporate fraud meant he never took a single piece of evidence at face value. Colton did not look surprised. He did not look angry or defeated. He actually smiled. It was a cold, terrifyingly confident smile. Colton calmly opened his own laptop and connected it to the large presentation monitor on the wall. He did not argue or shout. He simply projected a highly detailed, highly technical metadata report onto the screen. He explained, in a calm, measured voice, that the FBI Cyber Division had already intercepted Charmaine's encrypted emails to a shady audio editor 3 weeks prior. The report proved the audio file had been artificially spliced together from 32 different harmless voicemails I had left my parents over the past 5 years. Then, Colton delivered the absolute death blow. He pressed a button, and the high-definition security footage from the country club's terrace camera, the one he had secured on the night of the incident, played on the large screen. The silent, crystal-clear video showed me standing perfectly still, smiling politely, my lips barely moving, while Charmaine aggressively shoved the heavy crystal stand directly at my stomach. The irrefutable visual evidence completely obliterated the doctored audio. The defense attorney's smug smile vanished instantly. His face drained of all color. He looked at the undeniable metadata and realized his client had just handed him fabricated evidence to present to a federal prosecutor. He frantically yanked the flash drive from his laptop, shoving his papers into his briefcase. He stood up, declaring he was formally withdrawing as Charmaine's legal counsel, effective immediately. He practically ran out of the room, leaving Charmaine completely defenseless. The trap was permanently sealed. The federal courtroom was vast, entirely paneled in rich mahogany, and completely devoid of any warmth. 6 months after the disastrous deposition, the final sentencing hearing officially concluded. Charmaine stood before the stern federal judge, her expensive designer clothes replaced by a standard, drab prison uniform. She wept loudly, begging the judge for leniency, utilizing the exact same dramatic tears she had used to successfully manipulate Ariadne and George for over 3 decades. But federal judges do not care about superficial country club theatrics. The judge looked down from his elevated bench and delivered a scathing, unforgettable reprimand regarding her absolute lack of moral compass and her horrific willingness to purposefully endanger an unborn child just for financial gain. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with a resounding, undeniable final echo. Charmaine was formally sentenced to 18 years in a federal penitentiary, completely without the possibility of early parole. I sat in the quiet gallery next to Colton, feeling no joy, no sorrow, and no lingering anger. I simply felt a profound, incredibly light sense of absolute closure. Jason, the corrupt billionaire who had orchestrated the entire disastrous plot, saw his massive corporate empire dismantled overnight by the Justice Department. He received a 25-year sentence for racketeering, bribery, and federal conspiracy. The criminal network Colton had relentlessly pursued for 2 long years was permanently eradicated from the city. The collateral damage, however, extended directly to the enablers who had allowed Charmaine to become a monster. Ariadne and George narrowly avoided federal prison time because Colton's extensive investigation proved they were technically oblivious to the money laundering occurring within their accounts. However, avoiding a concrete prison cell did not save them from absolute financial ruin. The Internal Revenue Service imposed massive, crippling fines for the illicit financial activity. The downtown banks ruthlessly seized their sprawling suburban mansion to cover the outstanding, fraudulent debts Charmaine had quietly accumulated in their names over the years. Within 2 short months, their pristine, carefully manufactured lives evaporated entirely. The prestigious country club formally and publicly revoked their exclusive membership. The wealthy friends they had desperately tried to impress completely abandoned them, refusing to associate with a family disgraced by a massive, highly publicized federal corruption scandal. Roman quietly finalized his divorce proceedings, securing full, uncontested legal custody of his child, and immediately moved across the country to start over safely. Ariadne tried to call me from a cheap prepaid phone one last time. She did not apologize for anything. She simply demanded that I use my nursing salary to rent them a luxury apartment in the city. I hung up the phone without saying a single word and blocked the number permanently. She was a stranger now. 2 beautiful, healing years passed since the heavy doors of the federal courthouse closed behind my sister. The dark, bitter Boston winter of my past gradually gave way to a permanent, vibrant spring in our lives. We purchased a lovely, spacious house with a sprawling green backyard in a quiet, incredibly safe suburban neighborhood. On a sunny Sunday morning, the golden light poured through our large kitchen windows, illuminating a life completely free from anxiety and manipulation. Our daughter, little Alice, named in loving memory of the only grandmother who truly protected me, was now a remarkably energetic 2-year-old. She possessed Colton's deep, intelligent dark eyes and my stubborn, resilient spirit. I stood by the kitchen island, watching her happily chase a yellow butterfly across the lush green grass of our secure backyard. Colton was sitting on the patio steps, laughing warmly, completely relaxed, and entirely far away from the heavy burdens of the federal courthouse. He had recently been promoted to a senior supervisory role within the Department of Justice, a well-deserved recognition of his brilliant legal mind and unyielding integrity. I had also returned to my beloved career. I was recently promoted to the head pediatric nursing position at my hospital. Every single day, I walked the bright, bustling corridors, dedicating my life to protecting and healing vulnerable children. The deep, agonizing wounds from my childhood had slowly transformed into a deep well of empathy that I utilized to comfort terrified parents and sick infants. We had successfully built a brilliant, wonderful reality. The constant, suffocating dread of waiting for Ariadne's demanding text messages or Charmaine's dramatic, destructive outbursts was completely gone. Our mornings were filled with the sweet smell of baking cinnamon rolls, the rich aroma of strong coffee, and the pure, uninterrupted sound of our daughter's laughter. We no longer had to constantly look over our shoulders or worry about hidden financial daggers. We were surrounded entirely by friends we had carefully chosen, people who valued genuine kindness and mutual respect over country club status and superficial wealth. As I watched Colton scoop little Alice up into his strong arms, spinning her around until she shrieked with absolute joy, I felt a deep, overwhelming wave of gratitude. This beautiful, wonderfully ordinary morning was exactly what Charmaine and Jason had desperately tried to destroy. They had utilized every ounce of their toxic malice to tear our family apart, and they had failed spectacularly. We had not merely survived the storm, we had emerged stronger, more united, and deeply anchored in our love. Later that afternoon, I sat down at my quiet home desk. I opened a thick official envelope from the downtown financial institution. It contained the latest financial statement for Grandma Alice's irrevocable trust. The massive wealth had sat completely untouched, growing steadily over the past 2 years. I knew what to do. I did not utilize Grandma Alice's substantial wealth to purchase expensive designer dresses, luxury vehicles, or exclusive memberships to superficial social clubs. That money represented a profound, protective shield, and I intended to use it to fiercely protect others who desperately needed a barrier against the darkness. With Colton's brilliant legal guidance and extensive network, we formally established the Alice Foundation. We created a highly specialized, fiercely protective nonprofit organization designed specifically to provide elite legal representation and comprehensive medical advocacy for victims of hidden domestic abuse. We focused entirely on the vulnerable individuals suffering in complete silence behind the manicured lawns and wealthy suburban facades. The people whose abusers purposefully utilized financial manipulation, legal threats, and social status to keep them completely trapped. Our foundation quickly provided emergency secure housing, top-tier federal defense attorneys, and essential, long-term psychological counseling. We successfully turned my deepest, most agonizing personal trauma into a powerful, relentless beacon of hope for hundreds of terrified families across the state. We became the impenetrable shield that Grandma Alice had always been for me when I was a frightened child. As the charitable foundation flourished, something entirely unexpected occurred regarding my father. The absolute, crushing financial devastation, combined with the profound shock of discovering Charmaine's deep criminal betrayal, finally shattered George's lifelong, enabling delusion. Without his massive, protective bank accounts and his prestigious social standing, he was forced to finally confront the horrifying reality of the monster he had actively helped create. Unable to stomach Ariadne's continuous, manic denial and her desperate, pathetic attempts to maintain a fractured illusion of wealth, George finally filed for a quiet divorce. He moved into a very small, modest apartment on the edge of the city and immediately checked himself into an intensive, long-term psychological therapy program. After a full year of difficult, agonizing self-reflection, he wrote me a long, incredibly humble letter. He did not ask for a single dollar from the foundation. He did not ask for a magical reconciliation or demand to be instantly forgiven for his past actions. He simply took complete, absolute accountability for his terrible, cowardice failures as a father. He expressed a profound, genuine remorse for repeatedly forcing me to be the silent scapegoat for Charmaine's endless cruelty. After careful consideration and extensive, honest discussions with Colton, I decided to allow George a heavily supervised, highly structured visit at a busy public park to finally meet little Alice. When he saw his beautiful granddaughter, the proud, historically arrogant man I once knew completely vanished. He wept silently, his tired shoulders shaking, looking incredibly aged and thoroughly humbled by his own massive, devastating mistakes. I continuously maintain a strict, unyielding steel boundary with him, and he respectfully accepts it without a single complaint. Ariadne, however, remains completely isolated in her bitter, unrepentant reality, loudly blaming the entire universe for her spectacular downfall. I do not feel sorry for her anymore. The boundary kept us safe. If you are listening to this story right now, and you recognize that familiar, agonizing ache of being the perpetual outsider in your own family, I need you to hear these specific words very clearly. You are not crazy, you are not overly sensitive, and you are absolutely not the difficult one. Society constantly pressures us to blindly forgive and aggressively forget, pushing a highly dangerous narrative that biological blood automatically guarantees unconditional love and absolute safety. We are repeatedly taught that we must consistently sacrifice our own mental health simply to keep the fragile, fake peace at the holiday dinner table. That is a profound, incredibly dangerous lie. Family is not determined by a shared genetic code or a common last name. True family is determined entirely by consistent mutual respect, genuine kindness, and the undeniable, supportive actions of the people who claim to love you. Sometimes, the absolute most courageous and profoundly loving act you can possibly perform for your own future is to completely sever a deeply toxic bond. You do not owe your abusers your sanity, your personal savings, or your hard-earned peace, regardless of who raised you or what they claim they sacrificed for you. When you make the incredibly difficult, terrifying choice to establish a rigid, unyielding boundary, toxic people will inevitably escalate their vicious attacks. They will loudly call you selfish. They will orchestrate massive public smear campaigns, and they will desperately try to use your natural empathy as a weapon against you. Let them scream furiously into the empty void. Their loud anger is merely a desperate, pathetic reaction to permanently losing their favorite emotional punching bag. You must aggressively protect your peace with the absolute ferocity of a federal prosecutor building a massive, airtight criminal case. You meticulously document the undeniable truth. You secure your own safe sanctuary, and you calmly let their undeniable arrogance eventually destroy them. The greatest, most satisfying revenge I ever achieved was not watching Charmaine receive a harsh, 18-year sentence in a cold federal penitentiary. The greatest revenge was deliberately building a beautiful, brilliant, wildly successful life that she is completely and permanently excluded from experiencing. We survived the absolute worst, most destructive storm they could possibly throw at us. And we deliberately used that lingering darkness to build a massive, guiding lighthouse for others who are still navigating the treacherous, frightening waters of abuse. If you have ever had to bravely walk away from a highly toxic relationship to firmly protect your own peace and the physical safety of your true loved ones. Please share this story to help others. Let the entire world know that walking away is never a weakness. It is the ultimate, inspiring display of personal strength and survival. Thank you for walking this incredible, profoundly healing journey with me until the very end. May you always confidently find the courage to protect your own beautiful, undeniable light. The nightmare is finally over.